to say who are we trying to serve. So it could be that actually we've chosen a particular customer segment. So let me do it with this blue pen here. Let's say we've chosen a segment that looks like this. I'm going to call this our chosen customer segment, and it could be segments, right? Now, if that's the case, then if I look across the Flux model, what that starts to tell me is, if I was to draw these lines all the way through and out the other side, and draw this all the way through and out the other side, that there's actually a required portfolio of, let's call them strategic assets, okay? So actually my strategy now is no longer that. The strategy, in fact, is in here, because this is where we want to be looking, is that match between the two. Now, what that does is it gives us a little bit of a problem, because we now have two areas of redundancy that we need to deal with. And then there's some other issues which I'll introduce you to in just a moment. But the first thing is, this piece here, which I'll hatch in blue, is in fact redundant, and these assets we need to exit. And this is a lot easier said than done. The issue here is that quite often these assets are part of the fabric of what we do. It's simply easier to carry on doing what we've always done, rather than try and remove them. When I talk about assets and capabilities, I'm talking about people, I'm talking about processes, I'm talking about governance that's been set up, I'm talking about policies, I'm talking about data collection protocols, talking about intellectual property for technology, I'm talking about physical machines, buildings, etc. So fleets of vehicles and so on. And obviously all of this, if it's no longer valued by the market, that is still costing us money, so it acts as what I would call a black hole. So let's just, for completeness, say what we're trying to do is to access the so-called black hole, and the reason for that is we don't want to be continuing to invest in something which the markets no longer value. So a classic example in the modern era would be, it wasn't that long ago, that it would have been an asset in a mobile phone or a telecom service provider. It would have been an asset to have people who could service fax machines, for example. And then the market moves on, and fax machines are no longer something that is valued, and we still have our fax machine technicians in the organization and all the service processes and protocols around their activities with our customers. And it takes us quite a long time to actually exit this here, and it costs us money in the meantime. And the faster we can exit this, the less money we hemorrhage in that process. The second hatched area would be this area here. And this is even more difficult, because in this particular area we have a situation where, I'll write this in black just so it's easier to see, but in this particular case we need to exit this because it doesn't fit with our strategy. We've made an active choice. We have selected which segments we will serve, and by definition we have deselected which segments we will not serve. So actually this is a deselection of customer segments that are viable but no longer fit with what we are trying to do. And there's all sorts of reasons around the strategy and the vision for the organization why that is important. But what we definitely don't want is to just try and be a catch-all, as was the case here, where we're trying to be everything to everybody and therefore become nobody to anybody, if you like. So this here we also have to exit in the same way as this, but for different reasons. Here it's much more difficult. Here you are going to your staff who are employed, who are looking across the shop front, if you like, and saying, but I can still see customers who are prepared to pay for the services or the products that we provide. And so why is it that you want to make me redundant, or you want to reduce our activities or eliminate them? Because it seems very hard to swallow. And it's because you've taken a strategic decision to pursue certain segments and to exit certain other segments. So this here is fairly self-evident. This here is a lot more difficult to try and understand why you would do that exit. And then the last part of this Flux model, which is now starting to look a little bit busy, but just for the sake of completeness, is, to my mind, an ideal strategy would not just include patently self-evident market opportunities. In other words, we're not just choosing segments out there on the basis of there's evidence that there's a valuable segment to be served by the products and services that we would bring into place. And by the way, just before we move on to that piece there, obviously one of the things we have to make sure we do is we bring in the additional strategic assets required to close this gap. So while at the same time that we are exiting these, we are entering those technologies, people, processes, intellectual property, and so on. So that's quite an important thing to make sure we are aware of. The kind of downside being that at the same time we've got some of our staff and assets going out the back door. We're recruiting new staff and new assets in the front door, assuming, of course, we can't reshape or retrain people to fit in. And people do try that, and it's often takes a very long time and can actually cause us to get stuck in a particular way of working. But just one modification of this Flux model is, if this is the strategy that we decide to pursue, I would say that's the way that we should be thinking about it. However, it would be ideal to my mind if there was a piece that we added on here, which, to use Mark Johnson's terminology, we would call the white space. Okay, so this is things that customers don't yet know is going to be valuable to them. So a classic example would have been if you went to work on a horse every day and somebody invented a motor car, having gone to work on a horse for 20 or 30 years, the idea of there being a motor car, an automobile as an alternative, as a customer, you've got no way of making that leap cognitively without an external input from somebody saying we actually have the technology to translate from horse-driven to automobile type environment. In which case, if we have this sort of white space notion, another one, by the way, would be an iPod, for example. Customers were never really thinking about the iPod until it was in place. So we would complete and add resources into here, but if our strategy actually incorporated some white space possibilities, then in fact this brace would go all the way up to there, and we would be looking for the assets that would fit into this piece up the top here in order to address that. And this requires a type of investment which is slightly different. So if we think back to the conversation about strategy, where we talk about goals and guidelines, if the goal was to look 5, 6, 7, 10 years down the line, and we recognize that there's some things that are beyond the current planning time frame, which we know will potentially materialize, well then what we are doing is, in our planning, we're also budgeting for the possibility that we have capabilities to investigate this and be able to drive that value into the future. So that's the strategy Flux model. As I say, technically not a model, it's more kind of a framework, a way of thinking about strategy. One last quick point about this is that I used to think that you could really only apply this model or this view to a business unit, because a business unit, at the level of a business unit or at the level of a product owner, you could talk about customer segments and the portfolio that services those customer segments. But over time, I've kind of thought, well, if you have a business that's structured at a kind of local level into products or into regions, sometimes country by country, you could actually think one level up, which is a regional strategy. Well, the regional strategy would talk here about which countries are in and which countries are out for reasons of being able to access the segments that they have identified as opportunities for themselves. And if you take it one level up to a corporate strategy, again, previously I didn't think you could apply this to a corporate strategy, but actually you definitely can. Because in the case of the corporate strategy, you are taking a view about what business are we in and what business are we not in. And that's a classic corporate strategy conundrum. And therefore, on this side, rather than talking about a portfolio of assets, you may be talking about a portfolio of businesses that are dealing with the opportunities that are out in the markets across the globe if you're a multinational. Okay, so that kind of deals with the Flux model.